So we're going to get started again for the final session, the keynote speech from Alex Wall. And so to get things started, I'd like to introduce Isla Berman, who is going to do the introduction and the response to Alex's talk. So, Isla.
Thank you, John. And thanks, John and Adrian and all the students who put this together. I think it's been a great day. And John, for your persistence in bringing the exhibition, since I saw it first at the Kemper and was really excited and came back and said, oh, we have to get this, and then tried for a period of time and at some point gave up, which I probably shouldn't have done. And then John brought it, and it was a heroic effort, I know. And so it is with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Alex Wall this evening as our keynote, a truly interdisciplinary thinker and designer. Alex is an architect and urban designer who's currently a professor of practice within architecture and landscape architecture at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. After being educated at the Architectural Association in London, where he also taught for a number of years, he worked at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture from 1982 to 89 in London and Rotterdam. And during this time, he was involved in the Parc de la Villette project, one of the most important competitions of that period, and one of the most cited architectural landscape projects of probably the last 35 years. Although OMA's project remained unrealized, because obviously the Toomey scheme was the one that was built, its conceptual drawings and models became emblems of a new form of urban park for the end of the 20th century that anticipated, in many ways, the rise of landscape urbanism, as well as the critical role of the drawing and diagram as a means to both notate and strategically direct the programmatic choreographies that might occupy the site. Alex is the author of one of the most well-known drawings of this project, entitled The Pleasure of Architecture, the work that became not only the iconic image of the richly layered landscape and stratified programmatic field that marked OMA's entry, that also filled the page in the same way that the design scheme filled the site, but also became the signifier of the Drawing Ambience exhibition itself. In many ways, the work also exemplifies, in an abstract yet pictographic form, what Alex refers to in his article, Programming the Urban Surface, that was in James Corner's book, Recovering Landscape, as a rereading of the landscape as an active surface, structuring the conditions for new relationships and interactions among the things it supports. In addition to the AA and UVA, Alex has also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, at UIC, the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and the University of Karlsruhe, where he was a professor of international urban design and planning for 15 years, focusing on multi-scalar strategies for dealing with urbanization and climate change. His design projects and publications include his book, Victor Gruen, From Urban Shop to the New City, published by Actar, and other writings on urban landscapes, such as News from Nowhere, focused on urban development operating in between cities in the sort of middle zone, emerging landscapes of movement and logistics, and Sprawl is Dead, Long Live the Low-Density City, as part of MIT's Infinite Suburbia project. He was also a partner of Urban Matters and the ASP-UM Group International in Stuttgart, which won first place for a new sustainable logistics city in Istanbul, and many other important projects. His current research is focused on resilient settlements and productive aquatic landscapes, looking at long-term redevelopment strategies for coastal communities. It's great to have Alex here. Please join me in welcoming Alex Wall.
Thank you, Isla. Thanks for the invitation. I tried to get out of this when John first contacted me, then said I'd be happy to talk about the color scheme or the Pantone scheme for the silkscreen, but I see it's going to have to be more than that. I'm going to first describe the ambience of cities in the 1970s and an expanding field of images being produced as part of a transition from abstraction to the figurative. That's an introduction. I'll then talk about those drawings in there, the two Lavalette drawings, a kind of double narrative, the black plan, technological analytic drawing, and then the colored plan, which is a narrative lyrical drawing, one might say. I will then move on to 2 of 4 unknown projects that I was privileged to work on with Ile Zengelis, Matthias Sauerbruck, and others, a super team for the Greek island of Kefalonia, which undertook, perhaps unsuccessfully, to communicate the idea of or the synthesis between urbanization and a robust and resilient landscape. Then I'll move to things that are occupying me now, which is the question about the clash between settlement and nature in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And I will conclude with the question, why do some drawings remain? They don't slip away into oblivion. Most of the drawings in there, what is the strategic power that they contain? So first I'll talk about the figurative and the narrative urban anxiety in the 1970s, which after the last couple of presentations seems to be recurrent. At the time, Cindy Sherman was making her series of photographs like this, untitled film stills, this being the most prominent of them. There was, in the ICA in London, an exhibition of radical cartoons, and a goodly selection of these cartoons were about urban anxiety, everything from playing cards to murals. What are the anxieties that someone has in the street? Who's behind them? What about it at night? Who's down at the end of the street? So there was an awareness, and remember, we're in the 1970s when Gerald Ford wanted to dump New York, and so cities were not at their best time. The second thing that was going on concurrently in 1982 was the Zeitgeist exhibition in the Martin-Gropiusbau in Berlin, which broke the new German expressionist, young neo-expressionists, and there were also a group of New York artists there, many of them using a very expressionistic figurative, producing figurative works. The show was panned on both sides of the Atlantic, but the images being produced seemed to us at the time very striking, and indeed many of the German artists, Helmut Middendorf here with Flugzeugtraum, who were children in World War II, which means they would have experienced the bombing of the cities, had these slightly menacing paintings that seemed to be about more than just a wintry field with its dead stalks. Along with this interest in figuration, I became aware of a renegade group of Chicago artists called the Harry Who. At the time in New York City, outside of the neo-expressionists, kind of abstract painting reigned, and it was for sure that none of the Harry Who would ever get a look in a New York gallery. And the most interesting figure to me was Roger Brown, who made these paintings of cities and buildings and landscapes where there are figures moving around in them, sometimes introducing a question or disturbing element into the paintings. You made a lot of political paintings, but mostly I was attracted by the stylization in these paintings. He was a very good, his studio was in Chicago. He made a museum in rural Alabama, which is where he was from. He collected primitive, so-called primitive or native self-taught painters. And when he talked about his work, he would refer, for example, the great influence on him, his training from the cycle of the Life of St. John by Giovanni de Paolo in the Art Institute of Chicago, a kind of before perspective use of images and storytelling, where the most important event in a story is the largest on the screen, no matter if it takes place in the desert, leagues away, or whether it's in the front door. And at the same time, he was aware of the paintings of de Chirico. So he collected all of these things to make these enigmatic images. And just going one step further, if these images were about art and storytelling, we became aware of the documentary paintings of Materiality, a very important figure in Turkish culture, a painter of the 16th century. It turns out he was actually a diplomat, a mathematician, a swordsman, and a painter-cartographer. And these paintings, which may look like lyrical hobby paintings, were actually commissioned by the Sultan to record. Materiality went with the Turkish army from Istanbul to Baghdad with the mission of recording all the cities, landscapes, and nature, and building types. I've cut out of the lecture some of the analysis of his oeuvre, where one sees how he's abstracted and reduced into icons a great variety of materials. He also accompanied the Turkish fleet under Barbarossa in a journey in the Mediterranean, making some of the first images of European cities. So this is a kind of background to coming up to this most interesting of François Mitterrand's Grand Projet, the 5 huge international architecture projects opened to international architects in the 1980s. And the most interesting of them seemed to be this project for a new competition for a new kind of park. I think in the first volume of the 2-volume brief, it says, "This shall not be a traditional park." The fact that you needed to have 2 volumes about this thick showed that the organizers, after that first wonderful sentence, didn't really know what they wanted. And I won't show the diagrams from which the project is built, but this was in an area of Paris which previously was industrial food production. This was to be the largest slaughterhouse in Europe. The pigs go in at one end and your sausages come out the next. In 1980, at the time of the competition, it was a ruin, and you could see the sun setting through the building. It was one of the largest buildings in Paris, and some of the market halls of Baltar, there was one left. So this site, ringed by the periphery, get noise, there was a kind of roar. Once on the other side of the periphery was the 19th century ruins of industrial Paris, and the emerging quartier of Belleville, which had the most international, a lot of people from North Africa. So there are pictures of this from the ground where you look across the cityscape and there's no indication of what city you're in. So clearly something was needed, and just jumping to these 2 drawings, the master plan was a summation of layered strategies. It's not a design. And at the end of the first stage, when the 9 projects were chosen, the French Minister of Culture stood up on the stage and said, "Well, I don't know about this park. This looks like inside of a radio set." So the kind of chill went through everyone's bowels because we realized we probably weren't going further. So the idea was to take the central part of the park and make another kind of drawing in the second stage. I have my complaints with Jacques Lang, the Minister of Culture, because actually there's a lot of tip-up stuff going on here. As you move, your eye moves across the drawing. What the park is, that there is a landscape, is apparent, but we felt we were up against it, so I started a series of sketches trying to figure out what sort of projection this strange array of planets is. That you had to make 2 mandatory gardens. One was the astronomy garden, and one was the garden of your own choice. And I just began working and then reworking this thing, stealing from Roger Brown and creating, I would argue, we should have a black line on this on the same screen, and I did nothing more than illustrate what was already in the plan. But this kind of drawing was useful to communicate or to argue for the structure of the park, which was merely moving through the park in the axis which most people would move, whether it's on a boulevard or zigzagging through. You would cross these different landscapes. That and the border between the different landscapes themselves would be the experience of the park. And also at the end of the second stage, we created this model to show, goddamn, it is a park, it is green, and that even there is a kind of own nature within an ambience along the canal that can make it this fusion of industrial architecture and nature, which is going to be a theme. And in SML, XL, I think there's the association with the different plans, different program for every floor of the Downtown Athletic Club, which then gets one of the feed-ins for the creation of the plan, and then that image. There is a postscript to La Villette. I think the sore losers were retreated back to London and received a call saying, well, from a French minister saying, I don't know what kind of park that was, but can you appear next week? Monday morning we have a problem that we should look at. The problem was Mitterrand's 1989 Expo. The Expo Universelle would take place in Paris. It was planned to be on 2 sites. One site was where the present Parc du Citoyen is. And the second one on the abandoned railway tracks behind one of the railway stations on the other side of the city, so both sites on the Seine. And an international competition had just been completed with projects, all of which were wonderful and would take, I don't know, 10, 15 years, billions of dollars. Some one project, Rigatti, I think it was 6 living bridges would be built across the Seine. Unrealizable, but especially unrealizable since Jacques Chirac, who was the mayor of Paris, said, I don't want this here, or I don't want my city to be a construction site for 10 years, just so that you can add something to your political resume. So the argument was, can you produce in 2 weeks an idea about a park, that an expo which doesn't involve reinforced concrete, steel, 10,000 trucks. Is there another way of doing this? And the idea was to make both sides really just landscapes that are equipped and rigged, and that the pavilions, instead of having multi-million-dollar pavilions for rich country next to pavilions for poor country, was to say every pavilion is in fact a landscape in a grid, and the landscape and the cultural attributes of that country is the pavilion. Well, that's the Zone West, and here the drawings of William Nutteling's come exploding onto the scene with his, on the left, not quite sure what to call that, national pavilions, or theme pavilions that just consist of atmospheres, equipments, holograms. And on the right, a series of collages which were just meant to pound out images to say, well, then what do we exactly mean by that? And to just have a go at that. Meanwhile, on the other side of Paris in Zone Est, on the Seine, the theme was technology and informatique, whatever that means in French, and the idea was, with reference to Super Studio, to take the area where the sleeping trains were staged, just go ahead and pave it, probably put in water and electricity, build a shed along the back wall. This is another William Nutteling's drawing, and the shed would disgorge daily these machines with reference to Osaka 70, that would come out and animate the space. And likewise, the Thames, as the other part of the site is here, would also be a site. That these floating things would then move around and create a kind of ballet for the So what's happening is this kind of essay in indeterminacy and program without substance, first argued in La Villette, is here fleshed out once further, and perhaps we could consider it a practice run for organizing space, culture, and identity with merely technology and action, something that never came to fruit in those days, but something we might need to consider now. So I will jump to these projects which were produced in 1984, really following quite closely the Expo Universelle. Ilya Zengelis was approached by a Minister of Culture in Greece for the island of Kefalonia. It's in the Adriatic. It's not the sunny white sand, perfect beaches. On the other side of Greece, these are rough islands defended by the Venetians against the Turk. And there were 4 projects, 2 beaches, a bay, and a landscape which had a religious ceremony. And when the Architecture Aujourd'hui published these projects, because that's the only place they appear, this image was used, and the title was La Petite Transposée, which is nature invested, was the way Ilya translated it. He wrote it in French. And just to make the simplest possible definition of what that should mean, it is that nature cannot be nature without being invested with the infrastructures and attributes of metropolitan urban culture. I was saying to Nicholas earlier today, at the time this project was produced, a normal commercial firm in London received the commission to reinforce the top of Snowdon Mountain in Wales because it was being ground away by tourists. That's exactly what these 4 projects are about. To maintain cultural landscape, functionality of a cultural landscape in the face of the metropolitan program of tourism, international tourism. So the first project consisted of a monastery, a rebuilt monastery away from a town, both destroyed in the 1950s in an earthquake. So the new monastery was built upon rubble. And ever since the 19th century, once a year, people would come, it's a much older tradition than that, formerly people from the islands, but in the 80s, people from all over Greece jump in their Land Rovers, come out to the island, beat across the fields, which actually were where the nuns and the sisters and brothers grew their food, have a kind of party overnight here, selling food and drink, Defected Boy George tapes, whatever. And in the morning, there would be a service in the monastery, and people would bring the physically or mentally handicapped people, and lay them down in the alley, and the relics of the saint would be carried over those people, and stop at the well, and have a service, and then go back. And everyone else would jump in their Land Rovers, rip across the landscape to get back to the ferries to the mainland. So the government said, we stop this tradition. It's over unless we can find a way to maintain this cultural landscape and have this festival, which has an importance. So this is a rendering of the final project. The rubble is secured by a wall. The diagonal forms are marble benches with water and electricity in them. There's also a wall that maintains a ruined part of the town, which becomes a park. It's a park, podest for the monastery. The only new element really is a new road. Parking shall take place, I think, here. A landscape which would be reinforced with a kind of plastic net grid. So there's a model which is much more explicit, showing the kind of tension between these two figures. The plan showing the parking and those stripes. And a painting by Zoe Zangelis showing a valley, nature, but invisible to us, reinforced. So the second project, larger project, this is the town of Argostoli, the capital of the island. This is the bay. Futavos, across the bay is a bridge built in the Napoleonic times with, I think, 32 arches. The bridge was kind of sinking, so that restricting the flow of water in and out. So this was becoming stagnant. And the Greeks had the idea to make an asphalt factory dumping into the bay. So the bay was effectively dead. No one in this is a Google picture of the town, no one in the town used the edge of the bay or even the flat area here. So I just, without going too far into it, show the master plan, which along the two flat areas had a sports park and then actually a landscaped garden area. It's part of chopped off. 5 kilometers it is around the whole bay. Here you're up against the sheer cliffs. You can read the topography. There's a kind of hotel there, and that the surface of the bay would be activated, not merely for pleasure boats or perhaps even a rowing race, but by mechanisms, by devices that of their own accord would oxygenate the water. Mechanical engineers said we could put 2 large turbines here, one to push and one to pull, and begin to move the water out of the bay. Oxygenation will largely take place because of these, I would call them aquafollies, invented by Matthias Sauerbruck and sketched here in watercolor form. These projects were not carried out, despite the implication of Elia's text written for publication later, and the variety of drawings. We were not articulate enough, facing a political and economic milieu which would not and could not take action. The park at night. So, coastal cities in the 21st century, places of transformation, loss, and experimentation. Katrina dramatically exposed the utter absence of resilience in a city far away from us here. Sandy was embarrassing in exposing the frailties of cocky New York's 19th and early 20th century infrastructure. There are many cities on America's east and west coasts and the Gulf. And our thesis is that perhaps in Hampton Roads, a unique potential exists, an unusual potential. Hampton Roads, this is not well known. This is the Chesapeake Bay. Here you see the peninsula, Delmarva Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay, the great Virginia rivers coming into the bay. In place, the Atlantic Ocean is here. The biggest river is the James. So you've got Chesapeake, James, and the Atlantic Ocean. Elizabeth River is the industrialized river. The city of Norfolk and Portsmouth's first late 17th century cities, which from the get-go were ports and places of shipbuilding. Hampton Roads is so called because these are the roads. It's where ships can seek shelter out of the storms, and that's called roads, where they can heave to. And it's the largest and deepest deep-water port on the east coast of the United States. They need nothing more than maintenance, dredging, to take the biggest Maersk ships. The cities are sinking because of extracting water. The Atlantic Ocean across from the mid-Atlantic states has a swell where the Gulf Stream, it's 12 to 15 feet higher than the mean ocean level. These cities cannot sustain a full moon high tide today or rainfall. They have a euphemistic expression called repetitive flooding, which has allowed them to talk to politicians of left and right, or center and right, without using any of those words. It's the 37th largest metropolitan statistical area in the US. There's 7 cities, 5 right here. Norfolk is the largest, which has the United States Navy, coal terminal. Portsmouth has the United States Navy, the Navy Hospital, and a new port of Virginia. There's a second port of Virginia being built here. This is Hampton, with its 18th century forts, Revolutionary War, and Newport News, which is shipbuilding. Their most recent product is the Gerald Ford, the newest generation of atomic aircraft carriers. The federal government, between port and military, has 70% of the employment there. Without port and military, these cities would be let go. But because of the port and military, they have no other chance but to experiment. There is no conventional urbanism, architecture, landscape, engineering that can maintain these cities as they are with rising water. And the universities down there are very, very up to date with data, and what they say is coming exceeds my ability to grasp it, really. Unfortunately, it was built out as a suburban, low-density city in the 1980s, so after people should have begun to know better, it was filled with suburban houses. And the map that no real estate agent will show you is the War of 1812 map, which shows you a series of dry ground pieces of land, the extensive creeks and rivers which run through this figure, and then the full 40% of the land area is wet ground. And as I last drawing showed, it's been built over. Just making a rough retracing of the 1812 drawing, modifying it to the present contours, that's where all the U.S. Navy fleet prepares for deployment. White is dry ground, the rest is landfill or low ground. It's the coal terminal, that's Norfolk, and you see how much of all of these places is on shifty, low ground. In the Dutch Dialogues workshop last summer, gritting their teeth, the Dutch agreed that they would set the workshop parameter at 8 feet. That's 2 feet of sea level rise and 6 foot surge. They have 6 foot surge at the moment. The 2 foot sea level rise date is coming closer. But what you can see is the extent, obviously the creeks expand and start to break up this landform into an archipelago. Much of Norfolk is built over historic creeks, they call them legacy creeks. The water will take back the creek. If you fill the creek with concrete, the water will go around the concrete or under it. You don't ever fill the creek. And Portsmouth, where we're working, is apparently largely flooded. That's just the existing contours. It doesn't tell you about what's been built there, nor does it tell you about the actual pattern. So this place has to maneuver its way out of sinking, its inability to handle rainwater runoff, storm surge, and certainly rising sea. So as I said, there's no future for this industrial and military complex without experimentation. No conventional engineering, architectural, or programmatic solutions can negotiate the conditions of subsidence flooding, as I just mentioned. There will be no commuting from suburban ranch house to naval base or port. That's why I think the Tower of Babel Dutch scheme to build this kind of new city in islands off the coast of Jakarta is, I agree, it's also not the right direction. What rather has to be done, which is something we have a small grant to begin to investigate, is to look at two factors of the future of American cities on the coast, which will be part of everyday life in the future, and which no planner is thinking about and exist on no drawing. It's kind of like the town plans of Rio de Janeiro in the 1990s, which had a lot of white patches on them. None of Rio de Janeiro's 700 informal settlements was on their plan. So what will happen, and what was revealed to me by my graduate landscape students, this couldn't come to me by my own knowledge, but by landscape students trying to create a living structures to mediate this rising water, was condition A. And the first condition is standing water. When the storm surge stops simply draining away as soon as the storm is gone and it dries off. When the water is standing there and it's this deep, and then it's this deep, and it's this deep, this is not water which would be colored dark blue. Our maps show white for city, dark blue or gray for water. We'll start to need different blue-gray for this standing water. And the second thing so we want to look at that in this research. The second thing we want to look at is the mechanisms for slowly moving back settlement and the cyber-physical, or part natural, part engineered protective devices, which also have to be able to move with the water, which is where people who research these things in Holland are already going. So I thank my student, Hannah Barefoot, for depicting part of this new landscape in Portsmouth with standing water. In Virginia, they said to me on one of my first visits, "You don't understand. We believe in property rights." And the answer is, what's your property rights in that standing water? The real estate industry, only 70 years old, does not have the ability to deal with this. And in Hannah's project, parts of cities would become wet, and they would become the places for alternative people, the people who refuse to leave in any case, perhaps fugitives, to go to another city within the city. And just to show another one of her drawings, that the first stage, perhaps the only one, is to maneuver water, to control the movement of water as it moves through the city, also including trapping sediment, maybe for gardens. Let's see, I think I'm going to have to leave that there. Hannah has exposed an important topographical and surficial element of coastal cities of the near future, standing water. Today is neither discussed nor planned for. An important, even more explicit, will be the managed translocation of buildings, neighborhoods, and institutions. We also don't know how to represent it. I don't have drawings for this project. When we started, I hope to have drawings and animations in the fall. We don't have the drawings to communicate to people alternative futures so that they can begin to process the information and work with their communities and their politicians to find solutions. It's a forbidden subject, of course. But without the active production of drawings and projects and actions, that means the people in this room and the people who presented today imagining different watery or waterless future. Architecture, planning, and landscape will witness a kind of urban Dunkirk, the shambolic retreat of the British into the water of the English Channel as the German army approached. Architecture, planning, landscape architecture, helplessly standing by as cities are slowly taken. So, how should we then think? And I want to close this lecture by circling back to our exhibition and showing drawings of Cedric Price, who was a person in England who didn't build very much, but whose projects and way of thinking, way of posing questions are programmed into the back of several generations of British architects. Always questions, always how to do things in a different way, talking about operationality of architecture, matrices, inevitable change and aging, both of those as good, action and inaction, and even delight in uncertainty. The sketch here, for example, for the Fun Palace is where the Saint Pompidou came from. And Cedric's critical questioning is what we need, and maybe even this kind of drawing to begin to produce images for our future. Thank you.
I don't have a panel to summarize, but maybe I could. I'm officially a respondent and questioner. So I wanted to maybe take a cut across some of the things that you talked about, Alex. I mean, first, maybe to contextualize, this notion of the beginning of the work, and I also wanted, maybe because this is the last part of today, to circle back to the exhibition and the context of drawing as well. That first, the work in many ways, the Parc de la Villette project was sort of placed within a postmodern context. We could say maybe in relation to the sort of notion of the return of the repressed of the modern. So one part of that being the bringing back of representation, figuration, narrative, history, all of those things that were not a part of the modern, but also signification and symbolism on the one hand, and then the condition of material embodiment, or the return to matter. And we could say material embodiment both on the side of the kind of occupancy, the internal body of architecture, and the landscape, the living landscapes and ecologies, the external material bodies of architecture. And sort of moving from that to this notion of, you talked about the Park Expo at the periphery of consumer society, and the notion of the new park. And of course, what's fascinating about the project to me and the response, again, is this transformation, right? The industrial paradigm, the slaughterhouse, and even the banding of industry gets transformed into this banding and the striations of the park, but as a new nature. The notion of the disciplined body of modernism becomes the place of the park, of leisure, of play, as a kind of transformation of that. And even the idea, perhaps, of the emptiness of the modern in bringing forward the idea of building a form, framing space, now being filled or saturated with activity. I mean, one of the things that's sort of fascinating to me, both about your drawings, the image, and the model, was this idea that somehow the activity that was going on, that was programmed within the space, despite it being, let's say, indeterminate in some ways, was incredibly saturated, right? Everything became the kind of program where you had to sort of look for the architecture despite this incredible material condition in the models themselves. And I'm also, fascinated, of course, with how the object gets transformed into the field. Literally, the striations of the skyscraper gets, flattened, so figure becomes ground or becomes the field. Or the park as an urban park, architecture explodes or dissolves and becomes a kind of mini urbanism with a plenitude of activity. And I think all of these things for me are evident in the drawings and in the models and the representations, and they are concepts. I mean, because for me, the drawing in this sense is very much a kind of conceptual response, and even if I sort of carry this to the end of what you were dealing with, to the coastal cities, I'm sort of fascinated with the idea of how drawing gets used as a tracking or a rendering of the invisible and making that seen, that we respond to the things that we actually can draw. And the sort of funny condition that architecture, and we could say drawing itself, is in some ways trying to fix something that might be inherently mobile. So the return of the repressed at the end is, of course, nature also as this kind of return. And you're saying that, what we do as architects, we delineate, literally, or we bind things, that the parcelization of the ground that we've sort of captured and contained through our drawing is, gets dissolved as the water just sort of flows across it, and the notion of ownership disappears. So maybe, and that's as a kind of preamble summary, maybe the thing I wanted to come to as a kind of question is about you talked about drawing as the making of alternative futures, or the strategic power of drawing. And I wanted to return to the idea from Alvin Boyarsky of the drawing not simply as a representational medium, but also as a form of inquiry unto itself. That the drawing within the history of architecture has, of course, had multiple functions that are critical, and perhaps it being about developing abstract methods to think about organization or to think about the world around us. And despite, our kind of traditional architectural drawings, that those have expanded, especially since the time of Lavalette. The sort of mapping or notation of spatial choreographies that was so revolutionary, I think, within that project, became a kind of standard within architectural practice. How we use drawings for analysis, interpretation, critique, expression, generative production. And that these are very different than, I will say, either are descriptive encoded drawings for construction or communicative drawings. And I think it's interesting because you talked about this at the very beginning in relation to the first abstract drawing or plan of Parc de la Valette, and then the models and drawings that came after that were trying to be more communicative, and it's interesting to me in the sense that if these are whether they are representational renderings or kind of pictograms, that they try to render evident the experience of a project to communicate it. And I'm sort of asking myself, beyond their communicative instrumentality, what renders these types of drawings critical? Or in relation to furthering an architectural or urban agenda? Because I would say that all of the drawings that you showed were not representational in a traditional sense and are, I think, highly, highly critical. That's the first part of the question. The second part, so the second part has to do with ambience. So that sort of was about the drawing in a way. The second part has to do with ambience, and I said this earlier today that, I was sort of fascinated that the title, the drawing ambience, which, is the sort of doubling of drawing as the verb, the production of the ambient, or the passive sense of drawing as a noun that's qualified by its ambience, right? Where ambience becomes an adjective. And I was fascinated that in today's event, that there was this transformation from drawing ambience to representing ambience. I thought with the hybrid term, you could have picked one to hold on to and one to change, right? And I thought it was interesting that the drawing was let go, as probably a signifier certainly of something, and yet ambience was kept. And so I started tracking the ways in which ambience has been sort of described throughout today. First starting with ambience as the drawing of an atmosphere or environment. Atmosphere as being the qualitative affects. This is for you, Derek. Affect as opposed to effect, and I spent a lot of time with those two words myself over the years, that exceed the physicality or form of objects or their percepts. The external environment or the surrounds that qualifies an architectural work, and we could say it's many ecologies, or the environment as ground, surface, territory, landscape that supports and organizes the objects and activities that constitute the urban field. Ambience as milieu, that refers to the in-between or the middle of things. Ambience as the medium of transposition, where the drawing itself, we could say, becomes the mediating agent. And I think probably in the last panel especially, ambience as the unseen forces that are part of every project, how we render them visible, and whether these are events or choreographies of occupation, the indexes of matter and its movements, the generative processes of an ecological system, or the historical, social, and political forces behind the making of a work. And the last two, for me, and I think they're really evident in the exhibitions and certainly evident today, was ambience also as accumulation of information, the multiplicity of perspectives, the diversity of modes and techniques, also accumulation in the sense that the density of lines in something like the Libeskind chamber works might exceed any idea of linearity. And lastly, that ambience refers to a kind of outside or other, where the drawing becomes the other of building, or the unknown or virtual that precedes or follows reality. So I'm asking myself, what constitutes then drawing ambience, or the drawing of ambience, in relation to many of the ways in which ambience was defined today, or the ways in which you were defining it within your own work, or in thinking about what that means in relation to the future of architecture. So that's my question.
There was an opening statement about my presentation which I left off, which is how many types of drawing, types of representation does a project need, especially a complex project. And I think we could say that maybe most of the things I showed are drawings before. They're drawings of the project before it's a project. And the last drawings in the sequence, not the last one. The last drawings in the sequence are typical drawings that we inherited from engineering, plans, sections, elevations, and And maybe beyond that, the drawings that indicate how a community can use or negotiate, those might be at the end and the beginning. And then there may be drawings, you said there may be drawings that are about, don't know what they're about, but they're drawings of the project. And that you will never, you cannot get the ambience or the potential of the project from 1 to 5 media. You don't need 100 perspectives turned out by the computer. You need 5 or 8 or 9 different kinds of things probing at it until maybe you can make the construction drawings with complete confidence. And those drawings maybe have to be, if there are other people using whatever you're drawing, maybe they have to be part of this process. On the one hand, I had to cut out in order not to go on, William Newton's drawings where he makes cartoons and pictograms, and then his finished buildings are simply the pictogram made into a building. Not incomplete, this building. It's a totally legitimate architecture. You wouldn't have to see the pictogram. But it was in his head put together as a pictogram. It was an art building where he decided the demands for cooling the student center with hundreds of computers and hundreds of people making impossible heat levels. The best thing to do is to open up the roof and have a pool in the middle of the building on the second floor, and that water, it rains down inside the building, and that water is used and takes care of it. And that's all in a series of cartoons about how a building might work that precede the design of the building. On the other hand, we, with Henri Bavard, the team leader, Agence Terre, and I and someone else working as the urbanists, together with the artist Stephen Craig, we won the European competition for the restructuring of the territory running from Aachen, Germany, to Belingen in Belgium, across a piece of Holland. So about 70 miles by between 6 and 18 miles. And we were the only people who were able to develop a regional overbook. But my point is, we made a spatial project. So, okay, you win. You get your check, in the door it goes. And the former student had the idea of creating a communication project, so a spatial project, one. The second project was a communication project. How did those 3 countries negotiate with each other? How did the cities in the countries negotiate with each other? And how does the Dutch teenager know where the good party is in Germany? So that's communication on multiple levels. And further to that, one needed a managerial. And now we're getting towards what we were hearing earlier about what can we do, how do we engage social and economic issues that we would like to result in possibly a spatial. We would like to bring our spatial skills to, but you have to have the others. And because we did those others, the project is built.
I mean, and I know I'm not supposed to ask a second question because I'm going to hand it over, but I think because I was sort of interested in the fact that the drawing was the thing that sort of disappeared, off the title, and I wanted to, so that in my mind there was a kind of assumed questioning of the validity of drawing, and I think, even in the conference today, the validity of architecture has come up, and I will confess that I very much believe both in architecture and in the drawing, in both of those acts, and as architects that we're making drawings as strategic devices, and that is sort of part of our skill, and I'm using drawing in a very kind of broad sense of what that might mean. And so, and I'm assuming, and certainly from all of the work that you've shown, that for you, within the context of a future, drawing is still absolutely critical.
Well, I would answer the question about drawing ambience by saying, if you are a partisan for what architecture might be, can be, and you want to focus, in your office you want to focus on it explicitly and completely. And part of your medium will be drawings, new drawings that people haven't seen before. I support you 100%, but I also support those other people in your office who are producing other kinds of drawings for the things that we've been talking about. So drawing ambience may be all of those drawings themselves are an ambience, and the soul and potential of your project is carried by the group of those drawings.
Okay. So maybe I can open it up to our student Kate Holbrook. Microphone in hand.
Not sure if it's so first, I'd just like to thank you for a wonderful presentation. So my question has to do with time and the still image. So it would seem that the increasing complexity of urban, social, and environmental processes is often due to the acceleration of these over time. Time becomes a vital, though invisible force moving through the image, which is essential to convey the urgency or importance of a particular situation or circumstance. I think this especially rings true in your most recent work with coastal cities. And you even said yourself that the act of representing these situations and these natural phenomena is extremely difficult. And so I wonder, how then does time become embedded into the architectural image? And is the durational quality of the image in the digital age important? And has it been heightened?
Has it been tightened?
Heightened.
Heightened. Yes, the architectural image may be a still, but it's a still of what? What process? It's a still of what process? I mean, I think the issue of time, or Stuart Brand would agree, issue of time in architecture is not maybe one of the things at the forefront of your mind, but for landscape architects, of course it is, because they're dealing with issues of succession, and for urban design in the Germanic-speaking world, Städtebau, which is sort of more like urban planning, one of the key elements of any project is phasing. Which part starts, what follows, because that's a recipe not only for how a project could be executed, but of course the first part has to send a signal out. It has to capture the imagination of the public and politicians. So those kind of discussions are actually not merely something you do at the end of the project, but you may well do as part of the design. So in urban design and in landscape, time is a crucial and an elemental part of developing a concept that is resilient, that is a durable concept. And I think more and more the same is true of architecture. Maybe it was always true.
Rachel?
So, thanks again for an excellent talk. So my question has to touch on indeterminacy, which I think Ayla brought up earlier. Basically, I'm wondering, in the highly visual age we live in, there's a lot of precise representation. You'd suggested, when discussing about Parc de la Villette, a kind of public rejection of indeterminacy at the time. How do you reinterpret indeterminacy as a narrative tool? How do you reinterpret indeterminacy as a narrative tool in our current visual age? And is it comprehended on the larger public scale?
Okay, what was it? What is the tool?
So, indeterminacy.
Indeterminacy.
Yes.
Well, I think that's a super question, because I think if you're working with a community and you're working with potential outcomes of their neighborhood, especially when there are development pressures, then I think different outcomes is something that we have to find a way of expressing, not just verbally. We have to find images for that. I assume, I guess my quick answer would be you'd be able to show them scenarios. Some architects, their client wants X, and they already have a pretty good idea about them. But they're going to steam in and present him with Y and Z along with X. They want to scare him up, and they want him to say, where did you get that? So good, Z is out. And, well, I don't know, I can't afford that. Y is out, and there you are with what you want to do. In urban design, you always have to have scenarios in the beginning of the concept building and they are evaluated, and you keep all that, and then you progress with the project, but at some point, the government falls, or there's a recession, the thing goes into the drawer, and 15 years later, when it comes out again, you probably have to go back to the scenarios and then go forward. So those scenarios at a much smaller scale for a community would be, have to do with negotiating with the different stakeholders. We worked in Duisburg, Germany, which is old steel making, with ThyssenKrupp Steelworks. About 30% of it is shut down. Very high unemployment. Has 60 to 70% foreign-born, mostly Turkish, but not from all different parts of Turkey. Turkey near Syria, Turkey near whatever. Already not getting along with each other, Kurds. And there was 10 or 15 years of fighting. But now those communities understand themselves and are a unit. And unfortunately, it's a very desirable, there are a couple of very desirable sites there. So we created an internet platform, participative internet platform, so the community, so the young radicals, so the developer, so the other people, the investors from Turkey, so could initiate a conversation, and that conversation could go all over the place. Over time, you only had to maintain your participation. If you didn't bother, then you'd fall out of the internet, the platform. But I think it's those scenarios. I think it's very interesting, however simple your architectural project might be, is to, are there other ways of doing this? Can I evaluate that? And what does it tell me? So I think indeterminacy, I don't think that you can do anything about indeterminacy, but come to indeterminacy with indeterminacy. No, I don't have a fixed answer. I have 3 answers. And that's why the Tower of Babel Dutch engineering seventh heaven concept for Indonesia, that's one. That's a fixed one answer. You pay 102 billion. It's not 50 answers that can all work with different communities, different clients, different people. Some of them succeeding, some blocked, some getting information, but a kind of moving forward, like a flocking software, but moving forward.
Open it up.
Water.
I was going to say, Philip, since you...
Yeah, go ahead.
Alex, I want to ask you a question about your speculations about viability of scales and of relationships.
Viability, okay.
May I say it's extraordinary to see you here today and to reflect on the kind of contribution that you made in articulating, perhaps for a zeitgeist, the particular strategies in the iconic drawing of the Parc de la Villette, in the sense of a kind of faith of assembling frictions between elements, deliberately collaging things together in a way that produced remarkably fertile frictions by setting things against each other and by cutting against the grain, not in a huge transcendental field, but in a very deliberate kind of granular assembly. If that speaks of a kind of faith of some decades ago, then I must say that I feel quite anxious about the gathering today in another legacy of the AA. That is to say that Boyarsky's child, arguably, would be Zaha Hadid's body, which arguably then begets Patrick Schumacher's sensibility, which gives us a kind of transcendental parametricism with his notorious lecture last year at the European Graduate School about capitalism as being absolutely essential and fertile and necessary. So a tremendous polarization on one hand towards overarching kind of huge works. And then the counter-reaction to that, perhaps we also saw today in the incrementalism, however beautifully and emotively felt of perhaps Scott Sorley, who gave us this troubling axis in which anything other than individual immersion would be somehow an axis of increasing evil as distance increased, or the different remarkably small-scale projects which left open the question of the collective, or of, say, nation or chorus. I wonder then if you could speculate about scale and geometry that offers viability today.
I'm not sure about the geometry. The scale, I think, is... I think the urban ecologist, as everyone in the room knows, if you say to the urban ecologist, can you tell me about the ecosystem performance of this table? He'll say, sure, give me the parameters of the whole room. If you say the room, he'll say the building. If you say the building, he'll say the campus. In other words, it's part of what? So always to go up a scale to have a little critical distance and then tackle the problem. So I think there needs to be, as part of ambient, the ambience of drawings, there need to be large-scale a territorial drawing, your project in a territory, but we know and now understand that we have to know region and community are the two key scales, as Peter Calthorpe said. I agree with him. And so your project, how does it affect communities, and what is that project relative to the city region, let's say? It's like, it will play its part. I need to see it. To understand a project, I need to see it, even if it's a small project, in the scale of the whole city. And I think that's endemic to architects. I see in a jury, you see the invited guests, looking around the project drawings to get situated, as if just, I've said this to students, just, it's a planet Earth, Western Hemisphere, US, Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, take them on down. Then there's kind of a sigh of relief from the architects. Now they know what they're doing. So I think scale is very important, and the flip side of that is the top-down, bottom-up necessity for the big scale of government, or big scale of power, and the little scale, so-called, of communities, except a lot of communities also have power. And it's in Europe, you don't do an urban project without having the communities together with you from the get-go. And I had the experience of wheeling my bicycle through the Stuttgart railway station, surprised to see police in the station. I got out of the station and I see railway police in the station, a lot of people shouting, some dressed in black. I get out of the station by controlled exits, and there are city police, and then out into the crowd around the station, and for the first time since the Second World War, German army troops in the city. And that's because, despite the fact for 15 years there were regular reports in the newspaper, meetings left, right, and center about the work that would have to be undertaken in the city to change a stop head station to an underground through station, and what would have to be demolished for that, mainly historic trees, that they hadn't gotten across. I don't think they had the drawings. The drawings weren't there. There wasn't a fresco in the city, or a tile, or a model that people could walk past every day. The communities felt they were, where is our school? We're not getting a school, and you guys are building this? No. So I think we call it midway up. Bottoms up, top down. Midway up is a kind of the new expertise for architects to do with communities. And then the scale thing I already described. I don't know what the second part of the question was about. It was a nice question, though. I think this gentleman over here said he was going to challenge me, so I'm have a drink of water and
for continuing a long ongoing conversation. I want to pick up on something that I just said, where going back to the drawing in the drawing ambience, and you initiated the word inquiry. I think that's only the beginning, because for us and for Alvin, I'll come back to that. Drawing was a mode of thinking. It wasn't about the product. The fact that so many of these drawings couldn't be identified by the curators, how were they made? it's because they were about a process. It was one that John Haydick probably is the best representative. Was it verbal text? Was it visual text? No, it was drawing as a mode of thinking. Drawing as a proposition, drawing as a radical proposition of political change, social change, and in fact, restoring that not that we all have to build, but perhaps we must aspire to build, because it is the most articulate language with which we have to address issues across a wide variety of things. But then I want to return to representing Ambience, with all due respect to John and to Adrian. And I'm reminded of Peter Brook, who makes a distinction between representation and representation, because for him, each time a performance occurred, it was different. So each time we interact with the drawing, each time the argument is set up, that Cedric asks a question despite holding that terrible cigar and that always full glass of brandy, I can only say thank you, Alvin Boyarsky, because for Alvin, he established that architecture, in its broadest sense, could engage all those other disciplines, could be an active participant in an optimistic future, no matter what the apocalyptic fears we have. And the only criticism I have of what has been a marvelous day is Alvin would have been the most radical person at the table. And again, I can only thank him. So not really a question, but to say, go for it.
Well, you remind us that, that the fight that goes on between computer representations and the hand drawers and the computer drawers, this is a false argument.
Yeah.
We want both. Draw the future.
Are there any
I have a question. What we're seeing here are sketches and pictures and perhaps ideas, not necessarily concepts. And that may be healthy because it's all about the process. I guess what intrigues me is how, what is the sequence of thinking that's gone into the development, let's say, of that particular image on the right. For me personally, if I'm designing a building, I'm given a program from an owner, first thing I do is rewrite it. I think that we have a responsibility, as obviously I can see from your work, we have a responsibility to reinvent if we can, to reinterpret, to elevate, to project, to think for the bigger idea or the bigger solution, if you will, for the owner or for the client. And I guess what I think is wonderful about this, and I hope we never lose that, is that we're starting here with ideas and not concepts. And through the process, sometimes we can, as you know, take a full tangent in a new direction for a solution that wasn't envisioned in the beginning of the process. So that stage of development is so critical to then arrive at really what the project ultimately wants to be. And this happens to be a graphic representation, but this could have equally have been in a written presentation. And I guess my question here in the end ultimately is this, that do you ever arrive where, and I know I hate to be limiting in terms of what the ultimate possibility might be in the solution, but do you ever arrive and get this sort of synopsis of thinking? Because right now it's images, it's scattered ideas, it's thinking, but there's no, at least, that's not the intent tonight here, of course, but there's no real synopsis that says A, B, C, D, and E is where we really are through this evolution of thinking and the design process. And I think it's healthy on a personal level to take that stand, to take that position. and say, this is where we see it going. And I'm sure you have done that in your body of work. And I think for younger architects studying, okay, that in their own development, in their own education, that we as designers, and for sure at your level, okay, have to ultimately be decisive and direct the owner again in the big picture. I look at your earlier work, by the way, excuse me, of where the Seine River was and the development of that park and the layering and the process of walking through the park. You know, am I through the park, under the park, in the park? Am I along the water? Should the water have been brought into the site? Does the site, how big is the site? Is the site along the Seine or is the site with the Seine? And should they be integrated? I mean, there are really, as you know, really broad questions that can be asked. And I guess I'm happy to see from what I've seen tonight that in your thinking, that you're looking at these kinds of notions of possibilities. And if I really distilled it down, I'm saying it's a big stew. And we're throwing all these ingredients in there, and ultimately we're going to arrive with something that will hopefully serve the bigger picture.
Well, I think we all want the students, and we all seek in our own practice to bring something to conclusion, to bring something to a explicitness that expresses whatever the negotiation has been between client and architect. And that's something, for instance, the students will learn when they get out and work. I'll move backwards a little bit and say the other drawings which show where we are in Paris, just following from what you said, and does the river run through it or under it or on it, that's going to be taught here. The students have to do it. If they don't know how to do it in the beginning of their course, they'll know it at the end. I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about their professional lives, and I'm not worried about learning how to bring a project. That's not true. I have to control students all the time to do that. That's my day job. But what I'm worried about is the extent to which they can do this drawing. Now, this is Cedric Price's sketch, probably done after talking or while talking with Joan Littlewood, who was a theater producer, and she wanted a new kind of theater, and it would probably end up being in an industrial building, and she wasn't sure. She wanted freedom for the kind of things that could be produced there. She didn't want a theater for 70 seats and another theater for 140 seats. So what can he bring to that series of questions? And so what we have is the beginning of an idea about, well, there's a structure, and from that structure there might be suspended or rolling or other kinds of theatrical devices or buildings that include a theater. That's a technical problem to be solved. But most important is the open flexibility to produce different kinds of theatrical events, and that it's an appropriate image in King's Cross in London. Is that where it was?
Lee Valley.
Pardon?
Lee Valley.
Lee Valley. Thank you. To have the gritty industrial structures that existed in East London. And so this was never built by Cedric Price. It went through project drawings so that you could take his project drawings and give them to an engineer and the thing could be built. So it was developed from this sketch. It was never built. What was built was the Centre Pompidou in Paris, because Piano and Rogers took this concept, redid it, and submitted it, won the competition, and built a building that's perhaps a little different, but is recognizably from this, also the work of Norman Foster. So I'm not worried that students, and I'll explain why in a second, learn this because they either learn it under architects in practice or they don't learn and they're not architects in practice. What I'm worried about is generating an idea, finding a conflict, maybe a conflict in what the client wants, and learning in their training their gut in their head to come up with a concept that may be contrary in the beginning to what the client asked for, and to turn that over, because it might turn out that it expresses what the client wants more than what he was initially expecting. And where do I get this? This will be only a story I will tell. Where I get this from is standing at the AA bar in my third week in London or something. I'd already been stopped by the police because I was putting a poster that I'd made, a silkscreen poster with empty houses with a big red X through it, and the policeman came to me at night and didn't take me in. But I'm standing at the AA bar, and this other American guy shows up and says, "Do you know that they don't even teach you how to draw here?" And he messed up because Alvin was standing right beside him. So Alvin does one of his corporal sneers and says, "We don't teach drawing. If you want to be an architect, get it together. We teach you how to think." So I think the problems coming at us, I don't know what's going to happen in Hampton Roads or not, but the problems coming at us need people who can think, especially the embarrassment, the professional embarrassment of teaching people skills which may be quite useless in 15 years when the problems they face are utterly different. And if they don't have this ability to think counterintuitively and with sketches, with drawings, they can also do it on their computer with some new super things that aren't developed yet. But then they're not going to be able to solve it, and they won't build it. As the hockey player said, you never make that shot you didn't take. Alessandra.
So thank you. It was a great lecture, wonderful drawings. And your last comment, I was thinking, I want to make two observations. We have been using the terms drawings, but it's vague because, first of all, we're talking about architectural drawings, not any kind of drawings. And first, we have seen maps, we have seen diagrams, we've seen plan section, axonometric representation, perspective. So there is a full range of different forms of representation. Then I get to the point of, and we can discuss all of that, and also the audience. I mean, architects are drawing for different audiences. When you produce an image for a competition, it's an image that has to be seductive and convincing, etc. So if you produce a blueprint, you are talking to somebody else. I mean, it's different audience. So there is the discussion of, to be specific about what constitutes an architectural drawing and what is needed to an architect. There's a system, there's different modes of modality of drawings. And the second is, I'm not sure that representation is a good term when we talk about
what is a good term?
Representation. An architect does not represent. Represent means literally to re-propose something that is already there. An architect projects. So actually, architectural drawings are projections. You are throwing into the world something that is not there yet. So you are not representing, you are proposing, throwing something into being. And actually the Vitruvian word for the three types that Vitruvian proposed for drawings are ideas. He used the Greek terms, idea. So the architectural drawings are a representation of, if you want to use the word representation of ideas, it's thinking. So it's something that is thrown into the world that does not exist before, and it's an idea.
Well, I think you're right with the idea, because I think I propose that we use the word think. For instance, in the beginning of her work, Zaha couldn't describe her projects. She couldn't properly describe the project or what she was doing or what she had done. And so they had, in the very first publication, they said, well, what are we going to do here? We'll just make an interview. But you could say if it was the case that she couldn't describe the project, then her sketches were explicit beyond belief. I mean, her sketches, her thinking was clear. So maybe thinking is a very good word. And representation, you're quite right, because I think, I may have written it in things I submitted, it started to get to the point where in some German competitions, they would say there shall not be digital representations. There shall not be rendered drawings. Otherwise translated, don't throw us that shit. You know, make a hand perspective. You're an architect, make a drawing. Show us the ambience. Imagine that your finest Photoshop artist, who you pay 28% of the competition budget for, spending a week and a half showing your building, oh, is it dawn or sunset? And in fact, succeeds in showing something that has no ambience. And so you start to see I remember being in a provincial town and seeing a big poster for a development project. It was a hand sketch of the poster, 100% effective. There was a picture of the housing estate, so you could see the green and trees. You could sort of see its structure, figure out what its form was doing. Then there was a shot of the inside, and just a couple standing there doing what, I don't know. But it was ambience. It wasn't a representation. So maybe this word comes to a screeching end tonight.
So maybe we were right about keeping the ambience and wrong about the word.
Yeah.
I guess it's been a really interesting, amazing day.
Yes, congratulations.
I think we'd all, I don't know if this is working.
No, it's not.
I think in a way we thought we were doing something different from the exhibition. I think that was the objective of the symposium, in a sense, to do something more today. That was the whole idea of the today part. But I think what I really appreciated today was the introduction and the conclusion, and I think the way that they showed us so many continuities. I thought Igor's talk in the morning was so wonderful in the way that he demonstrated Alvin's activist nature and this kind of prehistory of the drawings in a way, a way of thinking. So I think I've also come around, especially after Alessandra and David's intervention and your latest intervention, Alex, to this idea of thinking ambience. But I think that was well introduced in the morning by Igor with his description of Alvin's practice. Or I was also thinking discussing ambience or something like that, negotiating ambience, or a kind of discursive practice, which would seem to be so much a part of Alvin's way of thinking the school and the curriculum. And I think Nicholas's introduction also really emphasized that. And then in your conclusion, again, the sense of drawing as a pure communicative tool, all these different ways of drawing to both discuss space, to annotate space, to strategize space in a contingent mode. So it was wonderful, these beginnings and endings, which seem to be somewhat separate in a sense from the content, I thought, of the middle, the milieu, seemed to actually activate it anew in really interesting ways. So thanks to everybody.
Yes. Thank you.
I just want to add, interesting that you should make that comment, Adrian. Early on in the discussions when we were developing the idea of the symposium, and Nicholas and I were emailing back and forth, and Nicholas said in an email to me, I think if you want to make this symposium memorable and worthwhile, you should talk a bit more about the concepts and themes that are relevant in drawing ambience. And I would agree, actually, that I think actually there was a significant degree of overlap and continuity between the two. So thank you for the provocation, Nicholas, for that. I'm not sure if we intended it to be quite the continuity, but I think it was. I think there's a heck of a lot of the themes, the kind of sense of political activation that was talked about in Igor and your discussion this morning. I think we saw some of that. I think we saw issues about the exploration, the implications of technology, the implications of kind of social discourse throughout the day. And I think those are our themes that were prevalent and were a significant part of the discourse at the AA in the period of Alvin's tenure as the chairman. So, I want to thank all of the presenters that came. I'd like to thank Nicholas and Nicola for their generosity in lending us the exhibition, for Igor and Jan for their tremendous support in enabling us to bring the exhibition here, and to all of the speakers who came today and contributed to what I think has been a fantastic discussion and a really vibrant set of discourses around these themes. So thanks, everybody.